lectured all around the country. She was friendly with Susan B. Anthony. They spoke together on different podiums, and she was a radical socialist. And over time, what's interesting about her story is the abolitionist movement in America, just like the prohibitionist movement, was very much dominated by Christians, by evangelical Christians, including many who wanted to convert Jews. So there's a reason many Jews weren't involved in the abolitionist movement. William Lloyd Garrison, the Liberate, he was a very, there was, very prominent abolition movement in America. And even though many American Jews were anti-slavery, although many were pro-slavery, and that's discussed in this book. But the one of the reasons Jews weren't more active is because of this overriding sort of evangelical Christian framework for the abolitionist movement. So that tension is very much discussed in the book, and it talks about how this figure, Ernestine Rose, became more comfortable and prominent in her Judaism as she experienced some of the anti-Semitism within the abolitionist and the socialist movement. So it's an interesting story. It's a very interesting story. And one of the things that makes it so interesting is America was sort of a Wild West frontier at this time. So many Jews who came to America, they could essentially reinvent their entire lives here, to absolutely reinvent their entire lives. That wasn't even possible. There were immigrants who came over in the after 1880, when there were huge waves of immigrants, families and communities immigrated together, and there were established Jewish communities on the Lower East Side, and then in Chicago. But when immigrants were coming in the early 1800s, there were no established communities. There were no established jobs or neighborhoods. In fact, one of the other figures that's discussed in this book is somebody you've probably heard of, named Isaac Mayer Wise. Isaac Mayer Wise is the founder of Reform Judaism in America, an extraordinary institution builder. The Union of American Hebrew Congregations, which is now the Union for Reform Judaism, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is the rabbinic association, and Hebrew Union College, which is the seminary. Isaac Mayer Wise created them all within a span of about 5 years, and they're all still functioning. I mean, he was a truly remarkable individual, most prominent rabbi in America. But basically, scholars say he never really was a rabbi. He was never ordained. He basically gave him, he was trained, he studied Judaism, but he was never ordained. He was never, in earlier times, the way you became a rabbi is a senior rabbi would bless you, and you had to go through a series of training. And it sounds like he kind of went through a lot of the training, but he basically just got up and left and went to America without ever really finishing and decided to call himself a rabbi. And it's truly remarkable because he was a remarkable rabbi. But this kind of captures some of the spirit of what was possible in America and what's discussed in this book. Now, really, the central question, sort of that he looks at the different figures, the lens through which he looks at it is slavery and geography, and how essentially one of the advantages of America for Jews, every culture has its dividing line. Every culture has who's in and who's out. This is basic. And in Europe, the dividing line of a culture was Christian or not Christian. If you were not Christian in Europe, you are an outsider. And there was so much anti-Semitism. In America, the dividing line was not religion. The dividing line was race. Always. I mean, that's from this is how America has always been structured. And so essentially, Jews, when we immigrated to America, were already in a kind of what scholars now say they were white. They were considered part of the dominant, powerful majority. Now, again, this is not to say there wasn't anti-Semitism. And in fact, one of the interesting scholarship she does in the book, or he does in the book, is there were several hundred slaves who converted to Judaism. So it's a really interesting story. I didn't know anything about this story. So it's a whole nother. And there were also very active Jews who would purchase slaves and as an investment in freedom. So there were positives, but essentially Jews were already a tier up, and that made America much more hospitable and freer. Jews could simply do more. Jews could live a comfortable life, and including in the South, and did not face that same sort of overriding persecution. Now, so then, how did Jews feel about slavery? This is a very interesting question. If somebody were to ask you, if you didn't know any of the history, and somebody said, did Jews in America, did American Jews oppose slavery or support slavery? What would you say? What would you say? Oppose. Oppose. Why? Why? What makes us, slavery was a part of the human condition. Slavery was everybody accepted slavery for a long time. Why would we oppose it? It's the Exodus story. It's the Exodus story. Okay. The Exodus story, any other? Yeah. Our Torah. Our Torah, right? Although, truthfully, right after the Exodus story, there are laws about how slavery functioned in Israelite society. But in general, you're right. Our part of our core identity as American Jews is, generally progressive. We have different points of view, but that's part of how we see the world, and that Jews have always been on the side of freedom. That the whole story of the Exodus is about God does not want one group, powerful group, to enslave another group. However, the truth is, and that's kind of documented in this book, is that essentially Jews adapted to whatever the surrounding community was. That's how Jews in the South were generally more pro-slavery, and Jews in the North were generally more anti-slavery. There were incredible exceptions. But that's generally how it lined up. So then, one of the things he does in the book is he goes into how did Jews who were pro-slavery justify that? How could you? There was a very famous rabbi named Rabbi Morris Raphael, who was in New York, and he was the most famous pro-slavery rabbi. And it sounds to me, he was one of those guys who's, like a really good polished speaker, but who really doesn't say anything when they're speaking. Like, I read through a couple, I read through, because people would talk about how great a speaker he was. I read through one of his sermons. I'm like, there's nothing there. It sounds polished. That's funny. I actually did a paper once on sort of the two great Reform rabbis of the early 20th century, Abba Hillel Silver and Stephen Wise. And I read through, Stephen Wise was an incredible speaker, but you go back and read through his sermons and it was just rhetoric. It was just over. I mean, he was very charismatic. Abba Hillel Silver was also a very good speaker. You actually go through and read his sermons. They were deep and profound and insightful. So it's just two different ways of it. So anyways, this guy who was very polished, very eloquent, was sort of the most vociferous pro-slavery rabbi in America. And essentially, the argument is the Bible condones slavery. Abraham had slaves. Jacob had. So it's sort of this kind of, if the Bible says it must be okay. And he was very prominent. And in general, there were Jewish slaveholders. Not, a few years ago, there was a professor named Leonard Jeffries, happens to be the uncle of the Speaker of the House, but the Speaker of the minority, although he has vociferously condemned him. But this guy, Leonard Jeffries, wrote a book where he essentially said Jews were the main slaveholders and slave traders, and it actually comes from the Nation of Islam, and it's totally false. Jews basically traded slaves, owned slaves in about the same proportion as everyone else. It was not any different. One of the other figures discussed in this book is a guy named Judah Benjamin. How many of you have heard of Judah Benjamin? Oh yeah, he's a one of the most, again, interesting, horrible. I mean, if you go back and horrible, but fascinatingly brilliant figures in American Jewish history. This was a guy, I mean, his story, he's born in the West Indies, because there was a small Sephardic Jewish population in the West Indies that were mostly traders. And they weren't really, they were nominally Orthodox, but they really weren't, they were just, they lived a small insular Jewish life in the West Indies. But he leaves, he goes to Charleston, South Carolina. He is a brilliant student. He goes to Yale for college when he's 14 or 15. He's a good student, but he is kicked out of Yale. And nobody knows exactly why. This is really interesting. Basically, because that didn't happen often. I mean, what basically scholars have concluded is that he was very likely gay, like 95, and that there was some sort of incident that led to his being expelled from Yale. It's fascinating. There's a whole, and the reason people say he was gay is so he comes back, let me go. So he comes back to Charleston, becomes an immensely successful lawyer. He's brilliant. He writes the law book that is used in Louisiana. He becomes partners with a very politically successful family. And so he becomes this incredibly prominent lawyer, first in Charleston and then in New Orleans, because New Orleans, and he marries a Catholic, very prominent Catholic family, the daughter of a very prominent Catholic figure, but he doesn't convert. Even though there's kind of pressure on him to convert to Catholicism, he does not convert, even though he has absolutely nothing to do with Judaism. His name is Judah Benjamin. So obviously people know he doesn't change his name, but he marries and they have a daughter. And about a year after he's married, has a daughter, she just leaves and goes to Paris and lives in Paris for the rest of her life. And he goes and sees her once every couple of years and sends money, and he lives a bachelor life. It's fascinating, but he continues to be this immensely successful lawyer, owns a plantation, ultimately elected senator, is offered a seat on the Supreme Court, but he turns it down because it's too boring. And he becomes essentially the Secretary of State for the Confederacy. He's Jefferson Davis's closest advisor. Another reason scholars say he was extremely close with Jefferson Davis's wife. It was like, he burned all their correspondence at the end of his life, but she kept some of it. So it's interesting. But anyways, but besides being brilliant, after the war ends, he's one of the most wanted Confederate criminals. He disguises himself. He somehow gets to Florida. He takes a boat from Florida to London. He has no money anymore. It's all, his whole estate, plantations. He becomes an apprentice at a law in London. Within 5 years, becomes an immensely successful attorney in London, writes a book on common law that's still studied, and dies a very wealthy man in 1885. He goes and sees his wife still, even though now she's closer. In Paris, he goes once a year and live. It's just a fascinating individual. So anyways, the author tells this whole story. But he was also, again, he was probably the most prominent advocate for slavery that was identified with the Jewish community. And he essentially the same kind of argument. And what ultimately happened is American Jews, like other groups, divided between the sort of Democrat know-nothing party, really not as much the know-nothing party, because that became anti-Semitic, but Jews divided between Democrats and Republicans, and they're essentially the same kind of arguments that divided the United States. Now, what happens after the war is there is a really shift in the Jewish community. So there are different phases of Jewish immigration to America. The very first phase is Sephardic Jews. You probably, and that started really in the 1600s during the Revolution. Kind of there are various figures over time, Chaim Solomon, but essentially it's a very small, pretty assimilated population. Jews in the 1600s, 1700s essentially assimilated into American culture. Some lost Judaism altogether, some preserved it. But then starting in the 1840s, there's a large migration of Jews from Germany. Anyone know why that period of time led to? Yeah.
There was a revolution.
Yes. Yes.
1848.
1848 in Germany, there were sort of liberal uprisings, revolutions of younger, sort of bourgeois Germans that wanted to overthrow the ultra-conservative political order. And there were many Jews who were quite supportive of this. And Jews were involved in leadership because over the last 30 years, since Napoleon invaded Germany, German Jews had greater freedom, not total by any means, but and that revolution was really quashed. And so a lot of those who were sympathetic to the revolution said, well, it's not much of a future here in Germany, we'll go to the United States. And they weren't forced to flee. So some of them who came had some resources already. They weren't rich by any means, but had some resources and were familiar with non-Orthodox Jewish life. Some were basically, you couldn't really be Orthodox in America. If you wanted to live a very, very observant Jewish life, you didn't immigrate. But they wanted to preserve some of the kosher laws, Jewish cemeteries. So essentially, at this point, there were about 30,000 Jews who immigrated to the United States in the late 1840s. And their top goal in coming to the United States was essentially to assimilate. I mean, it was really to build a life here, not to convert to another religion. You know, there are some instances of Jewish conversion, but not many. There are more today, actually, much more today, which is a whole nother story in itself. But there really isn't much, but there is a kind of desire to minimize one's Judaism. And that was another reason Jews weren't as active in the abolitionist movement, in union causes in the late 19th century. We tend today, we talk about, you know, the heroes of American Jewish life, but really 80, most were not involved. And part of that is there really was a desire to fit in to the larger culture. And the larger culture in the South, the larger culture is overwhelmingly Christian, white, and pro-slavery. So Jews, essentially, if you want to assimilate, get two of those three. You're not Christian, but you can be pro-slavery, or at least don't question. And two, you're already white. That's it. So this, again, this is documented extensively throughout the book, but it provides this tension. Now, American Jewish life begins to change starting in about 1880, 1881. There starts to be this mass migration. And between 1881 and 1920, about 2.3 million Jews immigrate to the United States. So think about that. You have a small population of about 40, 50,000 Jews, and then 2.2 million. So it absolutely transforms the character of American Jewish life. And that's when you begin to have this shift to much more liberal, the Democratic Party with Roosevelt. But Jews, the essential tenor and the shift in American Jewish life changes. But what's so interesting about this book is it really gives you that picture of a certain period of time. So we've talked about Isaac Mayer Wise a little bit, talked about Morris Raphael, we talked about Judah Benjamin, perhaps, and we've talked about Ernestine Rose, although unfortunately, that's the sad thing. There probably were many, not many, but more figures in American Jewish life who were activists, people like Ernestine Rose, but we just don't know about them. That's the sad, people didn't do as much history. It's harder to keep documents, much easier to keep documents today than then. So we don't know, but that's one of the interesting things about this book. I want to talk a little bit about David Einhorn. I mentioned him at the beginning, that he sort of his great grandson is the one who told me about this book, and he really was a central figure in Reform Judaism. But he was also he was an example that we look to today as somebody who really had strong Jewish convictions. He was a rabbi in Baltimore, and Baltimore is essentially it's a very pro-slavery state or city at the time. That's also where the Know Nothing Party, the anti-immigrant party, is very strong in Baltimore in the 1850s. So you have this rabbi now. He will only speak in German. So So Einhorn is you read about him. He's a very stubborn man, surprising, but he's an outsider. He's an immigrant and he's Jewish and he is adamantly anti-slavery. And in fact, he and his wife and two daughters have to flee Baltimore essentially in the middle of the night because there's a pro-slavery mob who is attacking the synagogue. And so he leaves, but he does not give up his convictions. Ultimately, he comes back, things stabilize, things are quieter after the war. But he really, this passage in the book caught my attention. I got to find this passage. It reminded me of how people would sometimes think of Arnold Jacob Wolf. Interesting. Well, it's a little exaggerated, but here. Here. Einhorn stubbornly continued to write and speak in German, deeming it the only suitable means for communicating the refined ideas he espoused. This is somebody writing about him. When he rose to the pulpit to offer his weekly sermon, silence engulfed the synagogue. The very soul of sincerity breathed in his words. The student recalled, even if many listeners had a hard time following the rabbi's, quote, artistic language and flawless, inexorable logic, one could see at a glance he was a very exceptional man whose solemn gravity and intense fervor indicated a life steadfastly given to the spreading of his inmost convictions. And then it also says, during his time in Baltimore, Einhorn seemed to be arguing with everybody about everything. That's a great line. But it kind of gives you a sense that the American Jews who were anti-slavery, who spoke out against it, were kind of the exceptions. They were the sort of difficult personalities, one might say. And that's really documented in this book. And that's really an interesting part of American Jewish history. If you think about it, we generally are a very progressive people, but we also want to fit in. We do. That's how life evolves. We want to be part. And I actually think that's partially what's going on in Israel right now too. Israel wants to be a normal country, and yet has to fight so many conflicts. I mean, this is a perennial theme in Jewish life. And that's another reason why this book was so interesting. And I think it's even more prominent today as there is more anti-Semitism, is this inner conflict American Jews, well, Jews anywhere, but American Jews are the biggest Jewish population, feel about both being part of regular society, espousing its values, but also having a kind of set of principles, set of convictions, practices that are different from the larger society and that are sometimes shunned and looked down upon. And this is a major tension that Jews experienced in the early 1800s and experience today. And that's partially why I found this book so fascinating. But I want to leave time. I know not many people have read it, but I know this is a very ripe topic. Jews and race, Jews and sort of political views today and the tension within the American Jewish community. So I want to open. Are there any questions, comments, things you're wondering about this book or American Jews in the Civil War? Yeah.
Well, wait.
Okay.
Who has their hand?
Sandy
All
did.
right. Let's try to.
Oh, all right. We'll get it next.
I was wondering, does the book talk about August Bondi?
Yes. Yes.
It's a Lutheran's character.
Okay. Tell everybody. August Bondi is a fascinating figure who is also discussed in the book. Tell. What do you know about August Bondi?
Well, I think that he actually was a supporter of John Brown and when he got involved with the Kansas uprising, So Kansas, there was, there were two, before the war, there was the slaveholders and the abolitionists were fighting there. And another, he was a Jewish immigrant, and I don't know much
Yes.
more about that, but another, it was interesting.
He was in August Bondy. Okay, see, this is what makes this book so great. This book is not the most well-organized book. It kind of goes all over the place, but it tells such interesting stories. And one of them is about this figure, August Bondy, who was born in Vienna. And he's part of that group of revolutionaries from 1848 who come to the United States. And he ends up living, he writes about how he was taking a boat up the Mississippi River going towards New Orleans and saw slaves on plantations and was just shocked. Although it's interesting, who knows? Basically what the author also says in this book is Jews who immigrated from Europe to the South, they basically knew what they were getting themselves into. So he talks about being shocked, but knowledge of Southern slavery was well known in Europe. So this is one of the things that he talks about in the book is when Jews did immigrate to the South in the early 19th century, were they shocked? And he basically says no. But August Bondy says he was shocked, and he ultimately ends up moving. If you remember American history, you remember the Kansas-Nebraska Act of the 1850s, where should they be slave state or free state? It will say let the residents decide. So it leads pro-slavery and anti-slavery all to move to Kansas, and they fight with one another, and there are riots and shootings and so forth. He's one of the anti-slavery Kansas settlers, and he becomes friendly with John Brown, and then he ultimately ends up in New Orleans after he's just a fascinating figure. He lives all over, but he was a very, very strong and very highly regarded anti-slavery activist. Yeah. Sandy, go ahead. Yeah.
This probably shows my naivety, but
That's okay.
I never knew that Jews were slave owners until maybe 30 years ago. One of my nieces informed me. And so, that bothered me. I was working with all blacks. I knew Black history. And I started telling myself, well, okay, if Jews were slave owners, they weren't like the other slave owners. They didn't carry whips. They didn't beat their slaves. It was a business thing. It was, they invested.
And that's partially true. Yeah.
But they were never, I believe they could never be cruel like the other slave owners that we saw, Gone with the Wind type things, where maybe they forced Black women to have sex and have babies and all that ugly stuff that we had learned in history. I said, the Jews didn't do that. It was just a business thing. Now straighten me out.
Well, it's a very interesting, it actually is one of the stories that he tells in the book is a slave owner who ended up marrying one of his slaves who converted to Judaism. And in fact, one of Thomas Jefferson's out of wedlock, Sally Hemings' daughter married a Jewish guy in Virginia, and the two of them moved to Wisconsin and passed as white and Christian. He tells us, fascinating. I had no idea any of this. So anyway, this is one of Sally Hemings' daughters married a prominent Jewish figure in Virginia, who then they left and essentially became Christian and white. So anyways, although I think they must have somehow, they had that famous Jefferson Sally Hemings family reunion, and I think that's how some of this came out. But anyways, I think, this is a very interesting history. Were Jews more humane as slave owners than others? Most historians would probably say no. Although from the stories I've read, it doesn't seem like there were the extreme, if you read about Judah Benjamin's plantation, it was, it was not, you don't read about the extreme, brutal plantations owned by Jews. You do read, I mean, at least I haven't. I could be totally wrong. One of the other interesting things about Judah Benjamin is, I guess lawyers have to argue things they don't often agree with. You have, that's part of the job. Alan, is that accurate? There might be times you got to represent people you may, but anyway, Judah Benjamin won a case for an insurance company where a ship, it drowned and there were slaves on board. And the slave owners sued the insurance company because they wanted compensation for the property that was lost. And Judah Benjamin defended the insurance companies and gave this incredible anti-slavery or pro-human, basically saying these are human beings also, for the Supreme Court, and he won the case. So Judah Benjamin gives this incredible, I don't know if people ever asked him about that later, but anyways, so you don't see these extreme pro-slavery, brutal views among Jewish slave owners. At least I haven't. I could be totally wrong. But I would say in general, most, unfortunately, we are mainly like everyone else. There are exceptions. And that's important. I mean, one of the great, Louis Brandeis, who I studied in college, Louis Brandeis was such a strong Zionist, and he was a brilliant, he was one of those, but he had this idealized version of what Israel would look like. He wrote something where he said, when there is a Jewish state, there won't be any criminals, there won't be corruption, it'll be essentially a perfect society. I mean, so he in some ways, because Louis Brandeis wasn't very active in the Jewish community, he was sort of so in some ways, he had an idealized version of what Jews were because he never really was a part of the community. And that was a really interesting, so essentially, I mean, I think Jews, we are remarkable people. We achieve remarkable things, but in many ways, we are also just like everyone else. We're human. We have emotions, good, bad. I mean, it's very typical. Yeah, Carol.
Thank you for this.
Yeah.
I want to read the book now.
Oh, good.
I'm always intrigued by titles. Why do you think it's called Fear No Pharaoh?
Well, I think this author is a very, very liberal, left progressive. And one of the themes in the Jewish community, very progressive left-wing Jewish community today, is identifying Trump as Pharaoh. So it's this is a prominent, I mean, during you see signs sort of equating or at least describing Trump as Pharaoh. So I think so he's sort of drawing on this theme, kind of connecting Exodus story with modern political fights today. Yeah, it's interesting. It's a good title. I mean, it's good. I thought it was a clever title. It does grab your attention. Yeah.
Oh, no, wait, QB.
Oh, QB. Okay. Yeah.
This predates the Civil War, going back to Revolutionary times. He was virtually general overflow and he became governor overflow.
Sure.
And what he did is, people came to Georgia were essentially people were debtors from the
Right.
British problem. And one of the people came there was a debtor, and George was there from the king to defend himself from the Spain and from Spanish in Florida, and they were losing people due to dysentery problems. And what the doctor did, he went to a local and said, look, he's a Jewish doctor. He says the solution is you have to have them wash their hands, which in those days was extremely difficult.
Yes.
The Oglethorpe said, okay, he adapted, and the penalty was, believe it, what I read was, if you don't wash your hands, you die. and very quickly, it solved the problem.
Does.
And then when the
It's good.
Spain came up to attack Oglethorpe, they were forced to go back, and then Oglethorpe turned around and attacked St. Augustine, and they lost there. Now,
Yeah.
in terms of But the king didn't care because he had a push there and the Hispanic.
Right, though the history of Georgia and Florida is fascinating. And also Florida is actually fascinating from a Jewish point of view because, Florida switched control so many times. You had the Spanish who were much more anti-Jewish, and then you got the English who were okay. It's really interesting. But you mentioned, I want to get back to the idea of, debtors in Georgia is another thing he talks about here a little bit, but we'll get back to that. All right, who else had their hand up? So, yeah, so, okay.
I haven't read the book, even though I will read it. But my understanding of reading is there were approximately the same amount of Jewish soldiers fighting for the Confederacy is fighting for the North, and it really came down to where you lived, who you fought for.
Exactly, yeah.
It just as an aside, if you had an estate or a plantation in the South, it's not likely that you interacted with the slaves at all. You had an overseer. And he was usually not, well, it's not like he was Jewish, and he would set the.
Right. Oh, one thing, I remember what I wanted, did anyone see that play? It was downtown, I think it was at the Water Tower Theater a few years ago about the Lehman Brothers. Yeah. So that was a really interesting, so the Lehman Brothers started off in Mobile or Montgomery, Alabama, one of the cities in Alabama, and they were cotton brokers. And they had slaves, so basically, I mean, they weren't especially pro-slavery or anti-slavery at all. And then but they profited immensely from, slaves were collateral. They were, it was so anyways, the story, they ultimately moved to New York after the war, and it's after the Civil War that modern banking essentially in America grows. And there's a lot of reasons for that, the Lehman Brothers. One of the things he mentions in the book is that people who've talked about the Lehman Brothers say, well, Jews couldn't really do anything against slavery in the South. It was just overwhelmingly impossible. But he tells a story in the book about two brothers. It's not three brothers, two brothers, similar to Lehman's. Their last name was Freedman. It was a different town in Alabama. And there is a man who is technically a slave, but goes into town, does things for plantation, and he gets to know this Freedman brothers, and he hatches a secret plan with them. After a few years, they purchase him from the plantation owner for $500, and then he essentially works off that debt to the brothers and then becomes free and moves. And it worked. And then he ultimately came. So that was that was not uncommon. That was one arrangement by which people could gain their freedom. It wasn't very common because it was very difficult. But it's a wonderful story in the book about that. Okay, who else had their hand up?
Jan.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if this was interesting in the book. We've been talking about Jewish people owning plantations, okay? But my understanding is that a big part of the slave trade was run by Jewish people. Now, I was actually on a Jewish tour of Charleston
Oh, yeah, it's beautiful.
about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And they brought us to this mansion of a very wealthy family. And one of us said, so how did they make their money? Oh, in the slave trade.
Yeah.
So, I think that, again, you could say, well, it's business, but
Yeah, it's
what
horrible.
is it? It's business and trafficking
Yes.
human beings.
Yes, no, but there were absolutely Jewish slave traders. His argument is that essentially it's the same percentage as everyone else. In that, I don't know, I know there have been people who have said that it was greater, but he seems to suggest that it was essentially the same. I mean, Charleston was the worst. I mean, Charleston was. It's an incredible museum, but they have that, I think it's like 3 stories of which was a slave trading market. And Charleston, and the synagogue in Charleston is right by that. I mean, you can walk, I think it's a couple blocks. And it happened to be that the rabbi at that synagogue, which is the oldest Reform synagogue, was very pro-slavery in the 1850s. I think his name was Maurice Levy. That's what he taught. And so it happened to be that Charles, that it oftentimes we have a member of our synagogue, remarkable guy. One of his grandfathers is the pianist Arthur Rubinstein. So yeah, that's one of his grandfathers. His other grandfather was a rabbi in Jackson, Mississippi, in the early 1960s, whose house was firebombed, and who did not just continued to be pro civil rights, and ultimately had just left because he got a different pulpit, I think in the late 1960s, but was a absolute stalwart, and that was the exception. That was not. There's a very, when Martin Luther King wrote the letter from the Birmingham jail, one of the people addressed in that letter is a rabbi, Rabbi Elliot Grothman, who was the rabbi at the Birmingham synagogue, who was not. He was certainly not pro-segregation, but was not supportive of activists. Whereas this rabbi in Jackson, Mississippi was the opposite. So well worth, if you ever, I don't know why people would go to Mississippi, but if you in Mississippi, I would see the synagogue. It's interesting. Okay, good, yes.
Yeah.
Jeff, yes, send me a great email.
I passed along a photo to Fran Lag and to Ness the other day when, in anticipation of this event. My great grandfather, Jacob Frieselman, the photo I sent them is him in his Confederate soldier uniform.
Fascinating.
So both sides of my mother's family were Southern, came over in like the 1850s from Germany and have which is a very typical Southern.
Yes.
But.
Did they own a shop? Did they start a? Yeah.
Eventually, so my understanding, and I have to get this right because my oldest brother, who's the family historian up in Minneapolis or St. Paul, is listening in virtually. Out of pressure. But yeah, my understanding was they were like
Peddlers, that's what everybody, yeah, very common.
And then ultimately, the family owned a clothing store in Eastern Alabama.
Well, it makes sense. If Jews didn't own land, they were immigrants. So you come here, most of the people are farmers and own land. And there's not really many jobs open, but people need stuff. And there's no internet to order. And so you go from town to town, and then eventually you build inventory, and then you say, okay, I got kids now. I want to, make a shop. And it's many Southern towns were sort of anchored by a couple of Jewish stores. And that existed really up until the 70s and 80s, when basically kids just moved. They said there's not much of an economic future here. If you're, in a small town in Alabama, you go to Atlanta. If you're in, smaller town in the Midwest, you come to Chicago. I mean, so this sort of era ended, but it lasted a long time. Yeah, other hands, comments.
I have a quick.
I have a quick comment. So my family went to Sardis, Mississippi. They had the shop there, and the Community Foundation for Jewish Education, sent us to Mississippi to do educators to go educate around. And I went to Vicksburg, and it's fascinating. The history of the Jews in the South is absolutely fascinating. And I usually cry when I tell the story, but we went to a synagogue and they wanted to learn Kaddish because the Jews were dying off and they couldn't say it. They had stayed at Torah and they had it open to what you read on Rosh Hashanah. And they used to do all the Holocaust education for kids in the areas.
It's amazing.
So, yeah, you should read the book. And there's also, there's an institute down there.
Institute for Southern Jewish.
Yes.
Institute for Southern Jewish
right,
Living.
right.
And that's also very interesting to see. And there's a lot of information out there.
Well, if you think about it, in some ways, if you are a minority, you oftentimes are more attuned and affirmative to your smaller part of the population of your identity. It's kind of like if you're Jewish in Highland Park, you're a dime a dozen, right? I mean, that's how it is. If you're Jewish and you live in, Southern Illinois, you're not. And so in some ways, when you're in a situation where you are the only one or one of a few, you're stronger in that identity. And so in some ways, Southern synagogues are actually fit. If you look at the strength and the endowments and so forth of synagogues, Southern synagogues are often much stronger than Northern because of the church culture in the South. And also because Jews supported their synagogue. They didn't have as strong federations like we have, so the synagogue was the center. Yeah.
Yeah, but I would point out, from the family's experience, I
Yeah.
think what I was taught, living in a small town, Opelika, Alabama,
Mhm.
9,000 people.
Wow.
And I always wondered growing up, of anti-Semitism.
Yes.
Being so thoroughly surrounded in such a minority. What made them accept it was they were white.
Yes. Yes, that's the truth. And it is. And it's also what today, and there is still, and let's say after slavery, there, even though Jews are not Christians, there is a kind of respect for the Old Testament in some very devout Christian communities that gave Jews a certain kind of stature and respect. And again, there were also people that wanted to convert Jews also, but there was also this element within Christianity that was sort of, it's actually very interesting. That's a whole nother, that could be a different lecture for a different class, but Christian Zionism, it's sort of, what's the name? It's people who are there are many people who are pro-Israel, pro the Zionist movement who come from a Christian background in the late 19th century. One of them was a very prominent American named William Blackwell, who was friends with Theodore Herzl. Okay, other comments, questions? Yeah. Yeah, please.
I think one of the reasons Jews have survived all these centuries is the ability to blend in, to fit their lives around what they had to do to survive,
Right.
where other groups long gone.
It's a constant balance. We have very strong values, and we want to improve the world, but we're also a very small people. And that's partially what makes Israel such a, I mean, in Israel, for many, one could say that when we didn't have our own country, that gives you a little bit more freedom. You can it's like when you don't have to make a living, if you're like the kid in the family and you're not really responsible for very much. So when you are living in another country, when you are a minority, it's difficult, but you don't have as much responsibility. You don't have, when Jews have power and have to make decisions, we have 2 million people on our border who are very poor but they also want to kill us. And how do we create a just society? How do we live our values when we have to make really, really difficult decisions that will upset everybody? And that is when we are minorities in a different culture, the task is kind of easier. We want to assimilate, but also preserve our own religion. When you actually have power and responsibility, it's a very different dynamic. And that's part of the challenge of modern Israel. Yeah.
When did the tension between the Orthodox and the rest of the other parts of the Jewish and community like the before and conservative really begin? It seems extreme now.
Oh, it is extreme. It began probably in the 70s and the 80s. But before, in the 1950s, you had these rabbinic associations in major cities where the Orthodox and Reform all supported each other. It's fascinating. And also many Orthodox synagogues up until the 1960s, men and women sat together. There are still, in the Lincolnwood tradition, there are still a few Orthodox synagogues where you know, they may have, they may have a mechitza in the back or somewhere else or in the front where if you want to sit separately, you can, but then they would also have sections where families would sit together. Orthodoxy got more extreme. And there's a reason for that. One of the reasons is in the 1960s, as American culture became more permissive, you know, sexually, television, the culture, dress, as we became more liberal, orthodoxy turns inward. Which makes sense. You know, you have to build higher walls. And the Orthodox also got very good at in the 30s and 40s, kids would grow up Orthodox and they would become conservative or reform. They would leave. That doesn't happen much anymore because of Orthodox Jewish day schools are very, very strong and the community is very strong. So essentially it's politics. As the power of the Orthodox community grows, the tension grows. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I seem to remember, maybe it was the early 70s, the whole "who is a Jew" phenomenon
Yes.
emerged, which is, you know, which was astonishing to most of us.
It is. Yes, and that was a direct, Orthodoxy became more extreme. I mean, a lot of Orthodox leaders wouldn't say that. They probably wouldn't, they would just say, we're always the same. But from any academic critical measure, you look at the level of observance, you look at the culture, you look at it's become, there's no law in Torah that says a man can't sit next to a woman on a flight. There's nothing in the Torah that says that. It's great. It is a very, very strict interpretation of the idea of shomer negia, that you can't touch a person. The idea you can't touch a person of the opposite sex was meant to prevent premarital sex. It was not, but it taken to an extreme, it's, well, I may have the danger of brushing up against somebody, so I can't. I mean, so it's kind of things become more extreme over time, and I think that's part of the tension. But the interesting thing is the Orthodox community in America is not growing as much. We see more, but in fact, more Orthodox Jews move to Israel. This is the Orthodox Jewish population in the United States would be much higher and would be a stronger percentage, but there is much more aliyah. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, I highly recommend the book. And I think it's just, you know, you look at the world today, we see so much tension politically, culturally, socially, including in the Jewish community. And it's sometimes useful to go back and see that a lot of that tensions existed all along. And you get through it. You get through it, similar to how we're going to get through today. But this is a great portrayal of a certain period in American Jewish history. Yeah, Bill?
Please repeat the title.
It's called Fear No Pharaoh. Fear No Pharaoh, and I'll give you the entire subtitle.
I'll send it out next week, so yeah, I'll put it in my Macomb weekly, monthly, that's coming out.
Fear No, let me get the exact title. Because it's
If you want it sooner, I just email.
Fear No Pharaoh, American Jews, the Civil War, and the Fight to End Slavery. And the author is Richard Kreitner, who's really I mean, he's got a good podcast. I listened to a couple episodes of it just to kind of understand how he wrote the book. And he's written about a lot of other interesting topics. So it's well worth it. All right. See you next time. Yeah. Thanks. Good to see you.